Hello, class, and welcome to my lecture on the 1960s and the Cold War. This is going to encompass a lot of different things, um, but I really think of all the time periods in history. This is one of the most quintessential time periods for U.S. history and shaping the U.S. as it is today. We're going to go over the Cold War. We're going to go over the culture, Vietnam, somewhat of a civil rights movement, but that'll be a totally different lecture, but I'll touch on it a little bit. And so this is going to be a lot. And so let's go ahead and get started. Now, these incidents as part of the Cold War is what we refer to as the U-2 incident in Russia. There you see the U-2, which is a spy plane, and there's the pilot Gary Powers. And at this time period, we didn't have satellites. So the way we took pictures of other places, especially like Russia, when we're trying to see what they're up to, is we had to use spy planes. And at the time, the U-2 was the most sophisticated spy plane that we were using. It could fly at very high altitudes, so as to try to avoid radar or being shot down. Unfortunately, in this incident, in May 1st, 1960, the Soviets spot the U-2 and use anti-aircraft missile to shoot it down. The plane comes down, and Gary Powers ejects, and he's captured and held prisoner by the Russians. In fact, and this is like to them proof of American spying and American treachery and so forth. But I'm pretty sure the Soviets are doing the same thing. In the Cold War, if we did one thing, the Soviets are doing it, or they did it, we did it. And so, like I said, they still have like pieces of the crashed plane in a museum in Moscow. As far as Gary Powers, he's eventually released in a spy exchange. And this is all done, on the down low. We don't talk too much about how it happens. There's a movie with Tom Hanks. I can't recall the name of the Bridge of Spies, I think is what it's called. And it's all about the exchange of Gary Powers for another Soviet spy that we were holding, kind of like a prisoner exchange. But what this does, Eisenhower apologizes, but this is just further proof to the Soviet Union that we're constantly keeping an eye on them and we're very threatening to them. But at the same time, like I said, I'm pretty sure they were doing the same thing to us. We also see the Berlin Wall built. Now, as you recall on last lecture, when we talked about the Berlin airlift, Stalin tries to cut off the city. He's unable to do so. So he wants to completely remove East Berlin, which belongs to him, away from West Berlin, and separate it completely from from the other half of the city. So what starts off as a fence, turns into a wall, turns into a guarded wall with machine gun nests and attack dogs and soldiers patrolling at all times. Anyone trying to cross through was killed. We know a couple of I think well over 100 people were killed trying to get across the wall. You can see here in the map where it would go through. A lot of people did escape. They dug tunnels. They snuck in, kind of like, smuggling in cars. Some people even built hot air balloons and flew over. There was all kinds of ways that people escaped from East Berlin into West Berlin. But this is just another symbol, like the realization, the Iron Curtain, the separation of the communist states of Russia and the free states of, Western Europe. Now, 1960 is also in pivotal years when it comes to elections. We see Eisenhower finishing his term, and we have one of the youngest people run for president was John F. Kennedy. And he's from Massachusetts. He comes from a very wealthy family. And in fact, his father, Joseph Kennedy, made a lot of wealth as a bootlegger back in the days of Prohibition. Kennedy's running on the fact that he's young and he has a well-organized campaign and he's handsome. He's very charismatic with the crowds. And he talks about, getting America moving forward. Now, his, like I said, his opponent in the presidential race is Richard Nixon, who was Eisenhower's vice president. A lot of stuff that the both of them agreed on, but there was certain things that were stood them apart from each other, which is some things when they look at domestic policy, which is what's going on in the country, and foreign policy initiatives. When it comes to Kennedy, though, one thing that helped Kennedy get over the top, and it was like the election was really close, and I'll show you in a bit, was the use of TV and his not his work is talking about civil rights. I'm real careful to say he did a lot, and I'll get into it in a bit. But one major sticking point that people had against Kennedy was the fact that he was Catholic, Irish Catholic. The United States had never had a Catholic president before. As you can see from some of these newspaper articles there, you see him, and a lot of people are saying that he was just going to be a pawn of the Pope, that all Catholics, swear allegiance to the Pope, and he's like their emperor and tells them what to do. So Kennedy has to actually go on the air and make a commercial talking about how he, will serve America first, not the Pope. But this was a really big sticking point for a lot of Americans. We also see between Kennedy and Nixon the very first televised presidential debate. And this is kind of like, where you start to see earlier, in 1950s, you see TV taking a role as far as consumerism, buying stuff, commercials and stuff. And here's where we start to see TV taking a role in politics. If you listen to the debate on the radio versus seeing it on TV, people that heard it on the radio said that Nixon won. But people that watched it on TV said that Kennedy won. And the reason is the way they presented themselves and the way they looked. Nixon was kind of sweating. He was, a little nervous. You could see it in his face. But Kennedy was calm, cool, collected, seeming presidential, able to articulate his answers well. And, and as you can see the quote there about some observer noted that Nixon looked like a sinister chipmunk compared to calm, cool, young, dashing, handsome Kennedy. Kennedy also pointed out a couple things that he would, be advocating for in his election. And that is he talked about how Sputnik really embarrassed us and we need to catch up. We need to, win this fight. And he also talked about a missile gap, that supposedly the Russians had more missiles than us and we had to catch up. So, here he is presenting himself as a very presidential with a plan and talking about what's going on in America, what we're behind, especially when it comes to missiles and the space race and stuff like that. And I will lead you forward. Now, when it comes to civil rights, I take issue a lot with the fact that Kennedy didn't do much legislatively for civil rights. And there was a lot of issues he actually had with the civil rights movement. But, he does intervene in certain ways in certain instances. He, steps up when Martin Luther King is in jail. He has people, reach out to him, especially like his brother, to his wife, and to try and get him released from jail. So, in the African American community, he looked like he was, reaching out. Civil rights. He stood up. He tried to do something. But in reality, he didn't want to. He saw a president in his mind as only being a foreign affairs president. He didn't want to really deal with domestic issues like civil rights. It wasn't something that was in the forefront. He may have mentioned here and there, but he really never pushed it, except when it gave him camera time. So and he and it is with the help of minorities like African Americans and Mexican Americans that gave him just enough votes to barely win the election. It is one of the closest elections in history. There's rumors, that talk about his father reaching out to old connections in the mob and stuff and certain labor unions to get the votes to narrowly push his son over to a presidential victory. It's a very narrow victory. But he becomes president of the United States. And this is when he goes and gives his famous speech where he talks about, like, ask not what your country can do for you, but ask what you can do for your country. Kind of like, and putting himself there, like, we're in this together. We got to work together to make this nation great. Now, there's a lot of nostalgia when it comes to Kennedy. There was a really famous musical in the 1960s. It was about Camelot, King Arthur. And it was one of his favorite musicals. And so his time period in the White House has been, referred to as the Camelot years. They almost appeared to the American people, and the American people looked at them almost like royalty. Even his wife Jackie would host, little TV shows where she invited you into the White House and showed the beauty of the White House, dining areas, basically like if it was as if she was giving you a view into Buckingham Palace. And people, like I said, they had this reverence to Kennedy, almost like it was a monarchy. And so, like, this is why we're so, and I think this also comes from the fact that he died, he was assassinated. And a lot of times when you have something like that happen, there's this nostalgia to who he was, like we have funerals when we talk about, like, all the great things this person was. So maybe because of his assassination, we have a lot more nostalgia toward Kennedy's years in the White House. Now, when Kennedy was in office, he did try to surround himself with what he, was labeled as the best and brightest. And one of them he kept close to him was his brother, Robert Kennedy. Robert Kennedy, he ends up making, Attorney General. So he's pretty much becomes the highest law enforcement officer in the country. And what is really, when we talk about the Kennedy assassination, there's all theories of, like, who was behind it and so forth. And, one theory especially involves Robert Kennedy is the fact that, like I mentioned earlier, there was a rumor that Joseph Kennedy, their father, reached out to certain mob connections to help get him some more votes in order to win the White House. So a lot of people, one of the many theories is that the reason they killed Kennedy is because when Robert takes office as Attorney General, he actively pursues and prosecutes the mafia. So a lot of people see like it was revenge for what he did to them, or whatever. So, just a little tidbit. Like I said, most of the stuff is unsubstantiated. We'll never quite know. There's been so many stories and conspiracy theories. I'll get into that in a bit. So when we look at the space race, and JFK comes in, like I said, talking about, how we're behind and we need to get there. So he makes this famous pledge about we will have a man on the moon by the end of the decade. And, sure enough, by 1969, Neil Armstrong is the, first man on the moon. And this is like when we finally overtake the Soviet Union in the space race, because all the other way over, the Soviets had been beating us. First, satellite in space, first man's mission in space, first spacewalk, first this, first that. It was only when we got to the moon that we finally beat them. And we only, we beat them, and it was a close victory because they already had a satellite circling the moon when we landed. They were literally on the dark side of the moon as we were landing on the other side of the moon. And this space race did a lot for us, a lot of good things besides, building, thousands of nuclear weapons. All kinds of technology is created for the space race that now, is just part of the way we live. And another thing about, like, ask not what your country can do for you or what, you can do for your country, about, public service and stuff. JFK establishes the Peace Corps, which are programs that were to go into assist developing nations, especially like Latin America and Africa and Asia, to help help developing nations, help build, water systems or bridges or new housing or set up schooling and stuff like that. And this is how people could serve their country, in that way, instead of like serving their country per se in the military. Now, the Bay of Pigs invasion, which, sets the stage for, what we refer to as the scariest 13 days in history. Okay, so a little background on what's going on in Cuba that leads to the Bay of Pigs invasion. Cuba had been run by General Bautista. He was pretty much a dictator there. He did good business with America, pretty much let us, have free reign in Cuba as long as he kept wealthy and his friends wealthy. And if he's being wealthy and his friends are wealthy, that means it's, most of the rest of the population isn't doing so well. And he's pretty much like selling off, the industry in Cuba to American companies. And so all the wealth is going to him and to America, but not to the Cuban people. So he's a very, very unpopular leader. So, we see, slowly a movement against him. And eventually this becomes led by Fidel Castro and Che Guevara. Their initial uprising doesn't go well, and they exile themselves to Mexico, where they slowly start to build up their base, build up a better army, get better organized. And even back home in Cuba, the stories of their attempt grow and grow, and the popularity grows and grows for them. So eventually they come back from Mexico and lead a revolution, and there's a lot of people in Cuba that really just side with him. So, some public support helps Castro eventually depose Batista. And so, as soon as Fidel Castro takes control of the island, he seeks to, because as we're there taking all the wealth out of Cuba, he seeks to bring, keep the wealth and the resources in Cuba by nationalizing, a lot of industry and land holdings, meaning when you say nationalize, I mean government ownership, government takeover. So, if you own, if you're American who owned 100 acres of land, that's where you, grew sugar, you suddenly lost that land. So this hurt America in the pocketbook. And a lot of Americans were angry and talking about, the evils of Fidel Castro. And so a lot of people fled from Cuba. And so, in one of the, many times the CIA makes a mistake, they're hearing all this dissent, these Cubans coming over that weren't happy with what Castro was doing, and they fled over here, and they mostly living in Miami and stuff like that in Florida. They start to get this consensus in their mind. They think that there's a lot of resentment towards Castro. And they feel like, well, we can't have a communist country just 90 miles off our coast. There goes containment. So slowly this idea comes into fruition that we will lead a hostile takeover of Cuba. And so we start to train, Cubans that fled over here. We gave them training. We gave them weapons. And the consensus was that, and sadly the problem was that the CIA is only interviewing the people that had fled from Cuba who don't like Castro. They didn't go into Cuba and take a consensus of the Cuban people. So in just talking to these people, it sounds like, well, everybody hates Castro, so this would be a good idea. We don't even need a huge force. We just need, a decent amount of force to land in Cuba, start the fighting, and the people will join them, and they will overthrow Castro. And that is the plans that were, led to the Bay of Pigs. They're organized, they're ready to go. This planning and this idea starts with President Eisenhower. Kennedy comes into office, and it's presented to him. And it's presented in a very rosy light. Say, like I said, the Cuban people are going to rise up. The minute our people land there, the fighting starts. They'll join them and overthrow, Castro. And it almost sounded to him like it was a done deal. So, he's young and he's first in office and he wants to appear as a Cold War warrior. Here they are saying it's a walk in the park. Let's go for it. So Kennedy signs off on it. And so what ends up happening, though, is the CIA was wrong. The people in Cuba loved Castro. Nobody jumped to these guys' side. No one helped them. They were left, to die and get captured there on the beaches of the Bay of Pigs. America backed off any support, any air support. They didn't want it to be seen outright that it was us doing it, but everyone pretty much knew it was us doing it, and it dealt Kennedy a black eye. But in a sense, I would say it kind of saved the world, and I'll explain why in a second. But, it's an extreme foreign policy failure for Kennedy. He's looking weak on foreign policy, and, it just does not look good for Kennedy. So, now, with the Bay of Pigs, Castro knows we're gunning for him. And so he's a communist country. He reaches out to, big brother Russia. And Russia's like, don't worry, little brother. We will send you arms. We'll send you troops. We'll make sure that the U.S. doesn't try anything against you again. And you know how we can make sure that won't happen again? We'll put some nuclear missiles in Cuba. Of course, they do this under secrecy. Because in our mind, going back to what I said about, we didn't have we needed spy planes. The other thing is, in order to get a missile from Moscow to Washington, you had to fly it. You had to have a bomber drop it. Now, they did have missiles that could launch and fire, but their range was limited. They couldn't get from Moscow to New York or, Washington, D.C. or so forth. So putting missiles in Cuba, and there you can see on the map the range of those missiles, suddenly they're able to hit most of the United States. And so in a sense, putting missiles there in American eyes is almost an act of war. And so what ends up happening is, they try to sneak these missiles into Cuba, but we do have spy planes, like I mentioned. And so we discover those missiles. And then becomes this big, race. Kennedy's presented with the fact the missiles are there. And, his military commanders are right away, let's attack, let's invade, let's bomb. But because of the Bay of Pigs, Kennedy is now weary about his generals telling him it's a walk in the park, it's a piece of cake, we'll get them, don't worry. So he knows to ask proper questions, which is will we get them all? Do you know where they all are? Are they armed? Are they ready? And a lot of these are unanswerable. So he's really shaky about what he wants to do, because one wrong move, we launch, and it's all over. So what ends up happening is, he gets a group of people together, give me ideas, I don't care how crazy they are, and they're referred to as ex-con. And this is all done in secret. He doesn't want the American people to know anything about this, because he's afraid of panic in the streets. Because if they find out about it, and and Kennedy doesn't have a plan, it's going to make it even more scarier. So he doesn't want to tell the American people till he has a plan. Now, there's all kinds of stuff going on that people are kind of hinting something's going on, like the people on who are on leave from the military get recalled. Everyone gets called back to their bases, and suddenly lots of people are staying in the White House who don't normally stay in the White House later and later. Like something's going on, but no one's quite sure what is going on. Finally, after entertaining different thoughts, different ideas, Kennedy comes up with the concept of what he calls a quarantine. Now, quarantine is in a sense in this incident is in the sense of blockade, but you can't use the word blockade because a blockade is an act of war. So he says we're going to quarantine the island of Cuba, meaning we're going to surround it just like a blockade, and we're going to inspect any ship coming into Cuba. If it has weapons, it's going to be sent back. Oh, and if it just has food or whatever, it's going to go through. And this is in a sense to see what the Russians would now do. So, would they run the blockade? Would they back off? And so, this is, becomes very precarious. What will the Soviet Union do? And so, November 22nd, 1963, Kennedy's running for re-election. And he decides to make a tour through Dallas, through Texas. At the time, Kennedy, like I showed you, he's barely elected. So, and especially in Dallas, there's a lot of anti-Kennedy sentiment in Dallas. For him to go there almost is it is in a sense a little dangerous. There's all kinds of things going on in Dallas, but when basically they didn't like what they looked at as liberal policies, and his talk about civil rights and so forth. So there's a lot of hatred in Dallas for Kennedy, and he receives a warm reception as he's driving through the streets of Dallas. And as he's passing the Texas Book Depository, several shots ring out, shooting Kennedy in the head and the neck. There you can see footage from the film that was taken, of his death. He is rushed to the hospital, and they work hard, but there's no bringing him back. On the right on the picture on the right, you see LBJ there. Lyndon Baines Johnson, he's a very fascinating figure. He's one of my favorite presidents to study. I'm not saying he was a great president. He did great things. And, we'll get into it in a bit. But, like, I just love the fact that, there's a lot of things that, so many different things about him that shouldn't be. For instance, he's a Southern senator, and so a Southern senator shouldn't be for civil rights, but he, he makes some of the best civil rights legislation in modern times. And we'll get into that in a bit. But there you see him being sworn in after Kennedy's dead. He's being sworn in Air Force One. So he's like one of the few presidents not to get sworn in the White House, or on the steps, excuse me. He's sworn in there with a picture of Jackie Kennedy. This is actually well thought out because they're trying to show a successful transfer of power. You can't see it real well, but she still has her husband's blood on her coat. And so when and there's this period of time from when Kennedy's dead to when Johnson gets sworn in that people are scared, like, about the transition of power, who's going to take over power, right? And they feel like, because we're in the middle of a Cold War, they also feel they don't know if this was, the Kennedy's assassination was the first step of many, of an invasion maybe. Maybe they were going to kill him. There was chaos in the country, and then we get invaded. There's all kinds of fear. And so, like, when Kennedy shot, LBJ is immediately protected. Like, they're like, well, they're probably gunning for him too. So, the decisions made quickly after Kennedy's death is that we have to swear the president in as quickly as possible so we can show we still have a leader. And this is why he's sworn in Air Force One. When JFK is laid to rest, I mean, it all work stopped. Everyone's either glued to their TV or on the streets watching. There's always this thing, like you see there, about where were you when you heard about Kennedy's death? Because it really shocked and scarred a whole generation. And there you see a picture of his son, John Jr., saluting his father. And like I said, this is the end of Camelot, and, the whole nation was in mourning. And then, let's go back to, the assassin, Lee Harvey Oswald. Lee Harvey Oswald, I know, I'm not sure how many of you guys like conspiracy theories, but there's all kinds of theories. Is like he didn't shoot him or the shot came from somewhere else, but it's been conclusively proven that, he was the one who took the shot. He used a full metal jacket, which means most of the bullet was metal instead of just the tip of the bullet, and that's why the bullet acted like it did. But, he takes a shot, he kills Kennedy. We know that for a fact. Now, what drove him? He was a little crazy. He had actually went to Russia years before to defect and work for the KGB, the Soviet secret police. They didn't trust him. They didn't believe him. They literally left him in a hotel for like a week while they looked into him. Is they like, is this guy a double agent? Is the guy just crazy? And eventually they kicked him out of Russia. So, he finds himself in Mexico, and then he's somewhere in the United States, and there's like, he's part of the Free Cuban movement. He's like in all these places, but we don't really have a really good sense of exactly why. We know he tried to assassinate a general before, but we're not quite sure what his motivations are. And therefore there is the mystery, because shortly after killing Kennedy, as he's being moved from the jail to the county jail, a man named Jack Ruby, a nightclub owner there in Dallas, shows up, and there you can see him shoots and kills Lee Harvey Oswald, which just leaves more of a mystery. Jack Ruby's never said why he did it. He was a nightclub owner. He was kind of linked to the mob. He was also linked to the cops. He liked cops. He was always around cops, which is how he was able to make his way as close as he was to Oswald. But murdering Oswald will always leave that mystery in the air as to why and what happened and why Jack Ruby did it. Jack Ruby never talked. Anyway, let's go to LBJ. Lyndon Baines Johnson. Now, Lyndon Baines Johnson had this idea when he took office, and there's a really famous speech he gives before Congress. And just to sum it up, he talks to Congress and talks about what he sees, what he's going to do in his presidency moving forward. And so he tells this little story to Congress, telling them that, you may not know this, but, he didn't grow up wealthy. He worked his way through school. Then he became, he went to work in this little Mexican-American school where most kids, didn't need. Well, there wasn't even a whole lot of materials. He ends up using his paycheck to buy materials for the kids. He's also very competitive. It's like, if I'm going to have a school, even if it's a poor school, be the best school in the world. So he organizes debates. He organizes spelling bees. But he says to, Congress that, like, when I was there, I saw poverty. I saw what racism does to a young child. And he says that I never, in my wildest dreams, thought I'd have the power to do something about it, but now I do, and I intend to use it. So he starts to push for all kinds of legislation. And what he refers to as this great society. He was going to create this great society out of America and this war on poverty. So he passes all kinds of things. And what you see there is just some of it. Medicare Act, Job Corps, Head Start, Food Stamp Act, Department of Housing, Urban Development, financial aid that some of you are on. All that's LBJ. There's just tons of legislation he passes to help people up. Like, he figures, if I can help you now, you can help yourself up, especially like to a college education, and help you out of the cycle of poverty. Along with this great society was his move towards civil rights. Under Johnson, you see signage of the Civil Rights Act, which limited discrimination. In anything funded by the government, there could no longer be segregation and discrimination. You also see the Voting Rights Act trying to stop this, all these things that the people in the South have barriers that the people in the South have put in the way for people to vote, which is stuff like, giving them literacy tests or count how many jelly beans in a jar, anything they could do to keep African American voting, they were doing. This eliminated it. Sadly, though, it's been Congress didn't renew it, and that's why you're starting to see all kinds of like voter ID laws and stuff like that. But all these things were to give power to minorities, because if you had access to the ballot box, then you had a voice in government. You could influence an election, and if you can influence an election, then politicians have to listen to you. And, as part of his war on poverty, you had him, create stuff like the Economic Opportunity Act, which gave, $1 billion to help inner cities rebuild and build themselves up for small businesses and stuff to help get people out of the cycle of poverty. Now, Johnson is able to push a lot of this legislation. And he has, two things behind him. One, he uses the death of Kennedy. He says, this is what Kennedy wanted, and I'm fulfilling Kennedy's goals. So if you're for Kennedy, then you're for me. And he also had this thing called the treatment. Johnson was a tall man, well over 6 feet. And he would not think twice about standing over these politicians, poking them hard in the chest, cussing them out, and telling them, you're going to pass this piece of legislation. And he was able to do it. He literally rammed this legislation through. So he finishes Kennedy's term. Then he has to run for his own term in office. And so his opponent at that time was Barry Goldwater, a staunch conservative. And he's looking at these great society programs as war on poverty, as wasted money, as socialism, and stuff like you hear today. And this is like when America should be doing. These people can help themselves up. And he's speaking, he's coming out from the other side against Johnson. But, Johnson at this point is very popular among the United States in general, not the South. In the South, well, he's hated. In fact, he loses his base, the one that voted him in. And he knew that was going to happen, but how much further can you go once you get to president, right? So, but for the majority of America who he's helping, he's very popular. And so this election, unlike John F. Kennedy's election, is very one-sided, as you can see in the map there. You can see the states that, Goldwater wins, and you can see, the very deep South and Arizona. And so beyond that, look at that. The rest of the country is for Johnson. Now, a lot of the stuff that he wanted to come to fruition didn't come to fruition in his time as president. Nowadays, we can see what he's done and the enormous stuff that has come out of his policies, like Head Start and financial aid, and Medicare, all those things. Like, we see it helping people. But at the time, it didn't really receive the funding it needed because it was hard to have two wars, a war on poverty and a war in Vietnam. And this is one of the things when I talk about why Johnson's so interesting. And why, I don't use the word great. He would be great if it wasn't for Vietnam. We would remember him as one of the best presidents ever if it wasn't for Vietnam. Because Vietnam's a dark shadow behind him. We'll talk about Vietnam in a bit. But before we talk about Vietnam, we have to set the stage of what the country looked like in the 60s when the war is being fought. So in the 60s, you have the baby boomers, now coming of age. And they didn't experience World War II. They didn't experience the Depression, and they came out and they were actually, some of the best educated people because of the GI Bill, because their parents are able to go and then they're able to sponsor them to go to school. You have a lot more people with a high school diploma and a lot more people who graduated from college. So you have a more educated group of individuals who start to use that education to ask questions, to challenge authority. So, a lot of them rejected the way the parents thought they should live, the way they should dress, the way they should act, the type of jobs they should have, when to ask questions and when to shut up. Well, they weren't for it. They wanted to do what they wanted to do. They saw some of the inequities of society and they wanted to speak out against it. They wanted to speak out against, with the whole conservative mindset of their parents. And there you can see a button, don't trust anyone over 30. And we see also this movement within all these college campuses of all of a sudden, filled with people that, like I said before about the GI Bill, getting educations that, never had it before. And they start, protest movements for free speech, to end racism, to end poverty. They start becoming part of the civil rights movement. So the civil rights movement isn't just a movement of African Americans, it's a movement of youth and African Americans. And they become part of some of these sit-ins and these marches. And it's all about this new world they want to create, like, Johnson's Great Society. So, we have Freedom Summer 64. They're taking bus rides, down to the South to help register people to vote. And they're, just very, very active in, social justice is the word we would use today. You also had, on the extreme left, is the counterculture, the hippie movement, peace and love, the opposite of the, of hate and the opposite of war, particularly the war in Vietnam. They were all, the fashion, just real laid back, not very conservative, lots of color to them. The exact opposite of the 1950s man in a gray flannel suit. Excuse me. You see, people living just in a very different fashion than anyone else. They look to, communes and stuff, and communes where everyone shared everything. It would, no one really owned anything, and you shared everything together. And, and here you can see some of the dress of the people of the time period. This is also a big time period of, use of drugs to expand your mind, as they would say. Going against the very conservative idea of sex. We refer to it as a sexual revolution. For the good and the bad, you had people that were just very open sexually and, multiple partners and so forth and all kinds of things. And then you had like I mentioned earlier, the movement to use different drugs like LSD and stuff to expand their mind, to see the world from a different perspective, turn on, tune in, drop out, as Dr. Leary said. And he was ex-Harvard professor who was all part of this LSD movement, almost like a religion. But there were also the dark side. There were many musicians that were cut down in their time, members of the 27 Club who overdosed on different different drugs, like, Jim Morrison, Janis Joplin, Jimi Hendrix, Keith Moon. They're all experimenting with these drugs, and and they all end up the drugs killing them. And, in the 60s also, music was such a big part of the society, of the youth culture. You had 60s rock, you had 60s folk music, you had 60s R&B. There you see a picture of Bob Dylan. I'm going to include some videos with this, and one of them will be a Bob Dylan song. But he hated the labeling of it, but at the time he was referred to as the voice of his generation, speaking out as to what was going on in that time period. And of course, you have the roots, like I mentioned before. The roots in R&B, blues, and jazz. All mixed together, creating all kinds of different types of music. From those roots, different kinds of rock music. You have the Beatles is very influential. Coming back, coming from England and bringing, this rock and roll that kind of disappeared for a while back to America and reinvigorating it. You start to see all kinds of stuff being introduced into music, especially like electricity amps and later synthesizer, all kinds of stuff. And one of the bands that accentuates, the hippie movement, the counterculture movement, and the music of the '60s was the Grateful Dead. They were really famous for what we call jamming. Not really like having music, but they would have songs. Like you can go buy Grateful Dead albums, or right now Google or whatever on YouTube a Grateful Dead song. And yes, there were songs you could listen to there, but what was different is if you saw them live. They would literally play one song for 30, 45 minutes, just jamming, playing off each other, riffing off each other, just creating this whole vibe to the point where there was actually people that spent their whole lives traveling with the Grateful Dead so they could, go to all their shows and see the new versions of these songs. And, the highlight of this big old counterculture hippie movement was, Woodstock. Woodstock is something that, was a 3-day concert venue with everyone who was anyone was there. There's a phrase that Buddhists use. It was a happy accident. And I'm including a little documentary about Woodstock here as well. So, please watch it. You get a lot more background than I'm going to give you. And plus, see the images. Oh my God. Like, it starts off like if you have a ticket for Woodstock, it's worth tons of money, because they sold some tickets, but they got to the point where they're trying to, because the concert venue got moved at the last minute, so they're trying to build everything up, and it was either build a stage or build a fence. So they once they knew they needed the stage, so they gave up on the fence. Once they gave up on the fence, they knew like this is it's going to be a free concert. And once people knew it was a free concert, people came from all over, literally leaving their cars on the highways, turning the highway into a parking lot. And so, some of the images you're seeing here, don't, show some of it, but you're looking at hundreds of thousands of people showing up. I mean, by the time Jimi Hendrix playing, which is you see there, you can see like half the background, there's no one there. He was the last artist to play. But if you see some of the images in the documentary, it is crazy how huge the crowds were. It was so bad that they had to fly in the bands by helicopter because there's no way they could drive them in. When we look at it, there you're talking also about like, what was going on there as far as like, tons of drugs and tons of things going on. But, there's a peace, love, and rock and roll. People, just having the best time of their lives. And in a sense, it also proved to, the older folks and other people that kids could get together in such huge numbers and nothing bad, just have a good time. One of the famous phrases about Woodstock is, if you remember Woodstock, you weren't really there because of the amount of drugs that were being consumed. And one of the center of the counterculture movement was San Francisco in, Haight-Ashbury. This was like the district where, everyone met and there was all these people taking over buildings, living together, and, really good quote is, from someone who was there, man named Alex Foreman. He says, it was like paradise there. Everybody was in love with life and in love with their fellow human beings to the point where they were just sharing in incredible ways with everybody. Taking people in off the street and letting them stay in their homes. You could walk down almost any street in Haight-Ashbury where I was living and someone would smile at you and just go, hey, it's beautiful, isn't it? It's a very special time. Hunter Thompson talks like they felt like there was sparks in the air, like you could make something happen. They literally felt like just their will would cause things to happen as far as like positive things for this country. So this is the background of the 60s. This is what America looked like. Now one more thing before I move to the next slide is this is the youth of America and what it looked like. This isn't exactly what their parents looked like and thought. But the youth of America, these are the kids, and this is the generation that would get drafted into the war in Vietnam. Now, little background about the war in Vietnam. Much like the war in Korea, you have a country that was invaded by Japanese forces and by different people, and eventually, when the war is over, World War II is over, to much like Korea, it is divided. You have North Vietnam, and supported by communist forces, and you have South Vietnam supported by the United States, more of a capitalistic country. This was only supposed to be temporary. They divided up for the time being, and then they were promised to have elections to choose what they wanted to do, and as far as reunification and what kind of government they wanted to do. One leader that emerges in North Vietnam is Ho Chi Minh. Ho Chi Minh is one of those leaders that, very, very charismatic. He lives, sleeps, and looks like the regular people. He doesn't dress nice. He doesn't, he dresses like the peasants. He sleeps on the floor like the peasants. He exudes what he feels, the country should be when it comes to his form of communism. Unfortunately for Ho Chi Minh, he was a great symbol of communism in Vietnam. But once the war starts, the people running the war don't listen to Ho Chi Minh. But Ho Chi Minh is the face of communist Vietnam, and he is a beloved face in Vietnam. And so as we move toward these free elections, in 56, these elections that were supposed to happen, many people, many Americans in Vietnam are seeing the sentiment against their President Diem. President Diem was a Catholic in a heavily Buddhist country who actively persecuted Buddhists. He lived very wealthy, and well taken care of. His people weren't. He was not very popular in North or South Vietnam. The most popular person in North-South Vietnam was Ho Chi Minh. And the Americans living in Vietnam at the time, knew that if they had an election, Ho Chi Minh would win. So when it's time for the elections, at the behest of the American government, the government of South Vietnam refuses to have the elections, denies them, their right. And so we start to see, more organized movement to get rid of the government of South Vietnam and to get rid of, the United States out of Vietnam. This starts off slowly as guerrilla warfare. There is a formal army in North Vietnam called the Army of North Vietnamese Army, the NVA. But a lot of when we talk about fighting in Vietnam is actually conducted by guerrilla fighters known as the Viet Cong. And these guys, because they're guerrilla fighters, were pretty much everywhere in Vietnam, and you wouldn't, walk in the streets committing terrorist acts looking like everybody else, not really in uniform or anything. And this is one of the many things that mires the war in Vietnam, and I'll get into that in a bit. So as we see that there's a lot of, there's a drive to dethrone, get rid of President Diem and reunify Vietnam, we now know that, America's faced with this, with this challenge of containment. And so the domino theory is born. And this is, during JFK, and then it goes into Johnson. Domino theory being that Vietnam falls to communism, all the other countries in Asia will fall to communism. And so, this is why we have to do something in Vietnam now. So under Kennedy, we send some advisors, which are special forces, to help train these people to fight off the Viet Cong and then NVA, the North Vietnamese Army. And then in 1964, an incident happens. There we have a boat in the Gulf of Tonkin, a U.S. naval ship, and it comes under fire. And they have to repel the fire. Then there's a second attack. And it's said that this is forces of North Vietnamese. And, in all honesty, we can't even prove the second attack happened. but this is used by Johnson and his administration to escalate the war. So the Congress passes the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which basically gives Johnson a blank check to wage war in Vietnam without actually declaring war in Vietnam. And this is something that'll change later. And so immediately he starts to send troops to Vietnam, 150, 250, 350,000. We're not ready for this. And so we end up having to start drafting individuals. The peak of the war in Vietnam is the Tet Offensive, 1968. Up until, in general, y'all tell you, we pretty much won all the battles, but we lost the war. And I'll get into that in a bit. So the Vietnamese are not doing, North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong aren't doing so well. So they decide one big attack on Tet. Tet is the new Vietnamese New Year. Huge celebration, just like when we have New Year's Eve. And so they figure most people will be on leave. Like the bases will be, lightly defended because most soldiers will be on leave out, celebrating. So what they do is they organize this mass attack all on that night on all the main bases in South Vietnam. And it's designed to be an overwhelming effort. And so, that night they attack and, they have a lot of initial success. They even get into the American embassy, but eventually we fight them back out. But what's going on at home is, this is the first televised war. And so, you could literally see some of the war unfolding, right? And so, even though the Vietnamese lose big, America starts to question things like, I thought, because the leaders are saying they're winning. And then you had this huge attack. Like, I thought we were winning. So a lot of people start to question what's really going on. Like, are we getting the truth from our government? Now, why, what was winning the war so difficult? First of all, we're trying to support a very unpopular leader to begin with. Then also, we're an invading country. We're invading these people's homes. And a lot of times, especially like in Operation Hamlet and stuff, if we suspected there was a village helping out the Viet Cong, whether they were or weren't, because, out of fear or whatever, we'd burn it to the ground. And there was a Marine, I think it was a captain, I can't remember his name right now, who, literally told the press, all we're doing when we do these operations is we're creating more enemy. Here we are burning your home down, killing your family. Of course you're going to be angry. Then, of course, the massive bombing in North Vietnam, bombing the cities, killing all kinds of civilians, creates more animosity toward the war. Because this war wasn't a war you could win by taking cities. This is a war, as the CIA would refer to, in which we had to win people's hearts and minds. And the way we're prosecuting this war did not do that. And of course, a lot of people, were being drafted. They never had an idea that I'm going to go to war. I don't want to be a soldier. They had plans. And here they are being pulled to a war that they didn't understand and maybe didn't even support. And so I was mentioning the televised war earlier. In the first war, you could literally see some of these battles, especially the Tet in 68. I can tell you stories from my mom and my grandmother about trying to watch TV just to see if they saw my uncles or my dad. I think I may have mentioned to you before, most of my uncles served in Vietnam instead of my father, and they're just trying to get a glimpse as to, what's going on because we haven't heard from them in a while and so forth. And this was a war that was really at home, especially for poor and minorities. Because rich people could get out of the war using many different methods, getting a doctor's note that they couldn't serve, going to college, or, fleeing to Canada. The joke was ROTC, run over to Canada. So the people that were left to fight this war were the people that couldn't afford any of those things. And these are the people being drafted. And this is where, the war was really coming home to a lot of people. Listening to stories as well when I was growing up about this being scared of seeing a nice car coming in the neighborhood, because that was probably coming to tell you that, your brother, son, husband, whatever, ain't coming back. In fact, during football games, it would begin with reading a list of the dead. This is how close the war was to everybody. So anyway, and going back to the Tet Offensive, here we are. We have our leaders saying one thing, we're winning, and then what we're seeing on television showing we're not winning. These guys are able to mount a huge offensive. So this, what we refer to as a credibility gap. Like, you're saying one thing, I'm saying something else. And slowly, as the war progresses and as America gets tired of, seeing caskets coming home, and people questioning why we're even there, what are we doing, there's this growing anti-war sentiment in America. And of course, this is at odds with some of the older, generations who see that as unpatriotic and so forth. And the saddest clash of the old and young happens at Kent State. It's there's a college-wide protest at Kent State University. National Guard is called in, and to this day we don't know if someone gave the order or they just fired, but they opened fire into the protesters, killing 4. There's a famous song that comes out of this called Ohio, which is also linked, on the page here. Please give it a listen, look at the images. But really, and then one of the quotes that comes out of this is, not only are they killing our kids in Vietnam, now they're killing them here at home, driving more and more the anti-war movement. Now, as this war is progressing, the anti-war movement is growing, and the anti-Johnson movement is growing. Because Johnson's the one's heavily prosecuting this war in Vietnam. There was a famous chant that they would chant outside the White House, which basically went like, hey, LBJ, how many babies did you kill today? So by this point, Johnson has antagonized the youth. He's antagonized the South because his Southern racist constituency, who usually supports him, now hates him because of all the stuff he did for civil rights. Then half the country's hating him because of the war in Vietnam. And he gives a speech in front of America telling them he will not run for president for a second term. So, in comes in Nixon, who runs again, and this time does become president. He promises peace with honor. He promises, I'll get you out of the war, I'll end the war. But, he's not called Tricky Dick for nothing. Literally, when he gets elected, not only does he not end the war, he expands the war. We invade Laos and Cambodia because the South Vietnamese army was using those countries as places to hide from us. We increased the bombing of North Vietnam. But eventually, the anti-war movement is just growing and growing. He talks about Vietnamization, pulling us out and letting the Vietnamese fight it for themselves. So, peace with honor. And he also says he represents the silent majority, those Americans who actually support the war, those good Americans whose voices have been drowned out by the anti-war movement and the civil rights movement and all that. I'm here for the silent majority. And we talk about credibility gap and people not trusting the government. We have to talk about the Pentagon Papers. I think there's a film called The Post, which is about this, but it talks more about the Washington Post, but it really starts off with the New York Times. But basically what happens is, in the middle of this war, just to show you what a quagmire this war was, the generals kind of get together and go like, how the hell did we get here? So they want an analysis in the war to, see where they're at. So they hire the Rand Corporation, a think tank, and they hire, historians like Daniel Eisenberg, who put together this report. They're allowed, they're given top security clearance so they can check all the documents and read everything. And they pretty much put together a history paper which basically describes all the lies told by the American government in order to get support for the war in Vietnam. And the fact that the war in Vietnam wasn't about domino theory. It was about, gold, rubber, timber, stuff. It was about resources that we wanted, and all kinds of lies that were perpetrated by the government. And so, the report's complete. They see it and they go, we can't let the American people see this. They label it top secret. Now, Daniel Eisenberg, one of the guys who puts this report together, and says it's very important for the American people to see this. So what he does is he turns it to the Senate Oversight Committee, because they actually have authority to see this, and he feels they should see this. But they say the same thing. We can't let the American people see this. But he's so, passionate about the fact that American people need to know why their sons are dying. So he eventually starts to send pieces of this to the New York Times, which starts to publish it. The Nixon administration sues the Times to stop them from publishing it. And so the Times hands it off to the Washington Post. And these guys, between these newspapers, they start to print what becomes known as the Pentagon Papers. And we talk about credibility gap and stuff. And this really pushed forward and illustrated to the American people that they've been lied to. So one of the positives that come out of this war is the 26th Amendment. Before this war, you had to be 21 to vote, but people were like, hey, at 18, I can die for this country, but I can't vote for the guy who sent me there. And so there's a big push, and eventually the 26th Amendment lowers the voting age from 21 to 18. In 1975, the capital of South Vietnam, after we pull out, we have troops, and especially U.S. Marines and Navy personnel still in Vietnam. And and when we evacuate from from Saigon, which is the capital of South Vietnam, this is the last of the forces in Vietnam. There you can see some of the rescue effort to get people out, because there was a lot of Vietnamese that worked for us who suddenly would be looked at in a bad light by the NVA and the Viet Cong, so they wanted to escape with us. My father was there helping people get out of there. They literally tossed helicopters off the decks of ships to put people on the ships to take as many people as we could as we were on our way out from Vietnam. The end of the war, 58,000 American people are dead. Huge psychological scars and physical scars. LBJ's Great Society programs become underfunded. They do pass a War Powers Resolution, which only allows the president to make war for 60 days and then he has to get congressional approval, because Congress has the power of the purse. They can fund the war, they can take funding from the war. Vietnam, the 60s, all this, to me, is as close to another civil war as we got. It really literally tore the country apart. The 60s was a decade of of things that happened that impact us to this day. It's a very important, decade in American history. And I really, really hope that you watch some of the videos I have linked here to get a lot more information and of course, a lot more visuals, and you can see what was going on. That's pretty much it for today. Just like I said, give the videos a look at, and now I'll talk to you all later. You guys take care. Thank you.